one of the many things I'm so appreciative in your writing is how much you emphasize the reliability of the Gospels as eyewitness testimony. I think I've been a pastor for 40 years now, and early in my ministry, it was very effective for me to point out the C.S. Lewis famous line about Lord, liar, or lunatic, so that, Jesus, everybody calls Jesus a great moral teacher, but this great moral teacher claimed to be God, and so he was either a liar, which would mean he's not a great moral teacher, or he was a lunatic, and therefore not a great moral teacher, or he was Lord, and it validates everything else he says. And that used to be so effective, and in a lot of circles it still is, but the comeback that I get sometimes with people now is, well, but did Jesus really claim to be God? Wasn't this something that was invented, centuries after, Jesus left the scene, and it was his followers out of love for him that, pointed these things out. But as you say, and just an increasing number of writers are pointing out to us, well, no, when we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we are reading eyewitness testimony. And so what do you do as a police investigator to sort of determine the credibility of an eyewitness, and how can we translate those principles into sort of interrogating Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to determine that they are credible eyewitnesses?
Well, I try to teach 10 principles in cold case that'll help you become a good investigator, but it comes down to 4 issues when it comes to eyewitness reliability. Number 1, were they really there to see what they said they saw? So people will lie sometimes and they weren't even there. So we have to make sure, and in this case, for the Gospels, it would mean, were the Gospels written early enough to have been written by people who could actually have seen this, or if nothing else, would be writing this at the time when people who did see it would be able to falsify them, would say, hey, no, that's not true. Right? So what we're looking for is the early dating of these Gospels. By the way, if you want to lie about Jesus, the easiest thing to do is to wait until everyone who knew Jesus is dead. Then you can say anything you want about him. So I needed to know, first of all, the first principle of eyewitness reliability, were these written early enough to have been written by people who were really there? That's number 1. Number 2, can they be corroborated in some way? Remembering that corroborative evidence does not mean I'm going to find a video, which we call, now, we're kind of spoiled in this generation. Everyone's carrying the glowing rectangle, and that rectangle is a high definition video recorder. And so we expect sometimes now, if this actually happened, I want to see it. Show it to me. But this was very much living in the moment. So I guess for Gen Z, they expect that there's going to be a video of every event. It'll probably get harder to convict people in trials going forward because that's the expectation. But in cases I'm working with in the 70s and the 80s, there were no video cameras posted at every corner. So corroborative evidence is going to be something much more partial. I call this touch point corroboration. So for example, if we said, well, look, aren't there archaeological findings that would validate and verify claims of the New Testament? Well, of course there are. But there's not a finding for every single claim of the New Testament, nor should you expect there to be one. The same thing happens in criminal trials when someone, for example, jumps over a counter and a witness sees him jump over the counter and later says, yeah, he jumped over the counter and he was wearing a t-shirt and jeans and he yelled, he had a gun, he yelled, get down. Well, I can go to the counter and find a palm print that would corroborate what the eyewitness is saying, because she said he jumped up on the counter with his palms and jumped over. But the palm print's not going to tell me what he was wearing. And the palm print's not going to tell me what he said or that he had. I have to trust some of this to the witness, even though I can corroborate a portion of it. Well, the same thing is true in eyewitness accounts in the Gospels. Is we can corroborate pieces, but that's all you should expect. Of course, it's becoming harder to convince people of this in a generation in which everyone's got 1080, video, high def video. But this is the nature of cold cases, and it's also the nature of examining history. The third thing you're looking for is, were they honest and accurate over time, or did they change their story? And what we have to do here is to be able to trace from the earliest iterations of Jesus through so for example, the eyewitnesses wrote the Gospels, but then they had personal students who they told the story to. If we can retrieve those documents from those students, we can see if the students record the exact same thing, or if there are slow changes in the text so that the Jesus of Nazareth is exaggerated over time into the Christ of Christianity. So I actually went back and traced the chain of custody from the gospel authors all the way as far as I could in history for each gospel author. Who are the students of the gospel author? Who did they teach? Who did they teach? Who did they teach? Did these people write anything about what they learned? And if they did, I traced it through to see if there were any changes in the narrative related to Jesus. And finally, what to do is to ask the question in eyewitnesses, well, is there some motive, some bias, some inherent reason, that something you could gain from lying to me? And it turns out there's only 3 areas that motivate any crime, only 3 areas, 3 motives that motivate any murder. It's always financial greed, sexual lust, and the third one is a huge umbrella, the pursuit of power. There is no 4th motive for misbehavior, any kind of misbehavior. All misbehavior, all sin is driven by one of those 3 things, and there is no 4th thing. There's only those 3 things. Now, this is actually stated by John in 2 John. He talks about this, but I didn't know Scripture. I learned this working cases because you see it over and over again. And now that 3rd category is huge, and it lumps in a lot of other stuff. And people will always say, well, what about jealousy? Well, jealousy about what? What are you jealous about? It's going to be one of those 3 things. Well, what about vengeance? What are you feeling vengeful about? It's going to be one of those 3 things. There is no 4th option. You know, when a guy walks in and shoots 30 people at a Walmart who look different than him, what causes that? Well, it's often caused by the fact that I think that whoever I am is superior to whoever you are. It's a pride, power, authority thing. It falls in the 3rd category. So these kinds of things are good ways to assess whether someone is lying, even if they are an eyewitness. And what I discovered as I'm looking at the gospel authors, they don't have anything to gain in those 3 areas. And there is no 4th area of gain. There's only those 3. So you can say, well, they're just crazy to do it. Well, if one person's crazy to say something, that's different. But we have how many eyewitnesses who are described on the pages of Scripture? It's not just the 12. There were 120 in the upper room when they replaced Judas with Matthias. So there were 120 candidates. There were 500, according to Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15. He says there are 500 who are still with us, who saw Jesus on the same day. Most of whom are still alive, he said. You can interview them for yourself. So how many people, now are we saying there's that many crazy people who are crazy in the exact same way? Yeah, that's possible, but it's not reasonable. Reasonable is that you have people saying the same thing because they observe the same thing. And I think that's a more reasonable, and they lack any motive. They're not getting rich, they're not getting girlfriends, and they're not even getting power. Remember, Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, he sacrificed the power he had as a religious Jew who was actually in charge of getting papers to execute Christians. That's the kind of power he had in a religious community that was bigger than Christians at the time and was far less persecuted than Christians were about to be. And yet he still moved from one group to the other at his own peril. Why do that when there's nothing in it for you from a money, sex, or power issue? Well, it might just be because it's true. And he saw something on the road to Damascus that changed his life forever. So as I looked at these 4 ways that we test eyewitnesses, if you're really honest, let's put it this way. If there were no claims of miracles in the New Testament, do you think anyone would doubt the historicity and veracity of those documents? Do you think anyone would doubt, as well documented as they have been through history, that Jesus of Nazareth lived and said exactly what's in? Take out the miracles now. So he's just a traveling rabbi who's teaching things to his followers. You have the Sermon on the Mount, you have the Olivet Discourse, you have all of those things recorded in Scripture, but there are no miracles, no resurrection, no ascension, no walking on water. If you stripped it down to just its naturalistic teaching, there wouldn't be anyone who would doubt the Jesus story. But when you insert the miracles, that causes the doubt. And that's not based on the veracity of those texts, because like I said before, take those out, you're in. That comes down to a presuppositional bias against the supernatural. That comes down to us just saying, I'm living in 2021, or 2020 rather. I'm already in the next year. That's pretty good, right? And I've just decided that miracles don't happen in 2020. And we're beyond the idea of believing in miracles. Yet, as an atheist, I still believed that the universe came into existence from nothing. Big Bang cosmology, the standard cosmological model, which is supported by the science, and most cosmologists and astrophysicists, they buy into this model, Big Bang cosmology. But that means that all space, time, and matter, according to them, came into existence from nothing. So we're already looking for a cause that's outside of space, time, or matter. So if that cause just happens to be a personal God, then the resurrection is a small potato miracle. The big potato miracle is Genesis 1, everything from nothing. So I just kind of hold my hand open on that bias, which I also held against the supernatural, and tested the documents and realized that it was my bias all along that was keeping me out.